This is the screencast for Chapter 4, Evolution and Biodiversity. Starting off, Planet Earth. What's so special about Planet Earth and how is life possible? The biggest factor is that we have water that is somewhere between 0 degrees and not 100 degrees. It can be, but it is in that sweet spot where you have liquid water, which allows a lot of transfer of water around the planet, but then also within these living things to transport nutrients and allow energy to kind of flow. All right, so along the way, if you go all the way back to the beginning, you've got billions of years in the past, and you have all this chemical stuff going on from the left side, and then eventually getting enough nutrients, phosphorus kind of in particular, allowing for life, very, very, very simple cellular type things to occur. And then again, over billions of years, you start getting small changes, and this thing eventually starts to snowball. And we've been in like this exponential growth in regards to biodiversity for, I would say, a long time, but actually in regards to the entire picture, a very small amount of time. But that's how exponential works. A lot happens in a short amount of time. And here's a nice little depiction of that. Looking at like a full day, if we think of just time on Earth, or the last billion years or so on Earth, you can see that for the most part, if you pause and take a look at this, that not a whole lot was going on for most of the day. And then really, most of what we consider like exciting stuff is really just in the last couple of hours. So you think of like the dinosaurs, not that long ago, maybe around 11 o'clock or so. And then when you think of humans, we are just like, a quarter second before midnight in a day. So that's really kind of hard to get your mind around, but it gives you a little bit of perspective of time on Earth. All right, there's a lot of things that go into species changing. So the idea of like, how do species change? You've got this artificial selection, which is kind of stuff that we do a little bit now. And of course, originally, naturally, you have this, natural selection, how things kind of just sort of happen, but it's usually because of competition for resources or space. And then just random things like mutations. And these are some of the things that go into that. This is just looking at a couple of finches and some changes that they adapted to, having a common ancestor, but based upon wherever they live, they have different adaptations. Okay, so when does evolution work out? As I already mentioned, you have genetic variability, which happens partially because of mutations, which again are just sort of random. But there's reasons that some things happen more often. And coronavirus is a great example. The idea that you have these huge turnovers. Now, it's a virus, so we kind of tend to not classify that as something that is alive because it needs a host to do all the things that other cells and living things don't need. But if we just use it for this example, this conversation, we're already now talking about a variation called mu, but we've had several variations along the way, and it keeps changing, and sometimes it's not that big a deal because it's not beneficial, but sometimes it does work out. So the Delta variant we've been dealing with for a little while, for the virus, has been more advantageous to spread. And again, just looking at these things that are hereditable, if you're thinking about a normal species, these traits, changes, need to be hereditable, meaning they can pass from one generation to the other. And of course, for it to work out, ideally, this is something that is beneficial, adaptive. Okay. New species. Some things that you can have is hybridization, in which two species that could be different even, that mate. So this little example here is the liger, the lion-tiger mix. And this one here is not, if I'm not mistaken, does not produce fertile offspring. Sometimes species can produce fertile offspring, but usually for hybridization, for the most part, it doesn't typically work out. But sometimes it does, and then given enough time, it can create a new species. In regards to a new species, something else that can change is coevolution. If species are competing against each other, think like a gazelle and a leopard in Africa, they kind of evolve together. And so one becomes faster, the other must come faster. And I'm just using that as an example. But given enough time, this can generate new species because of pressure or environmental changes. All right, 3 different types of pressures that we're going to look at for a species. And you can kind of take a look at this as the first one, the stabilizing effect, is if you have an original population, which is the dotted line, kind of spread out, you've got a variety of species or traits within these species, and then there's some type of a pressure on the entire population. The outliers, the ones on the edge, sometimes are eliminated, and it kind of tightens up the group, and there's less variation, but the ones more common, the traits within the group, those are the ones that hang around. The ones that were a little more fringe, those traits are removed. You can look at directional, think like climate change. If it's a really warm change that's coming in, I'm just using that as an example. If it's a really warm change that's coming in, the population may shift, where the ones that are intolerant of maybe a colder climate, they don't hang around. So the entire population is shifted in one direction where it is more suitable. And then you can look at a kind of a weird one where you have something, this environmental pressure that's coming down really hits to the center. It hits them all, but it really does a change to the center. Think like maybe a wetter environment. Some species it tends to do well in a wet environment, but it needs kind of both dry and very wet, maybe like living in water. And this environmental pressure may come down where it's a very wet environment. And then it can divide the population to species maybe that prefer more time on land compared to a portion of the population that spends more time in water. Okay, limits. Are there limits to natural selection? Yep. The gene pool, when you have these changes, if there's a change, it needs to be something that's in the gene pool that allows this change to take place. So, for example, there's radiation in the environment. Well, if there's nothing in the gene pool that allows an adaptation for radiation to take place, then the population doesn't benefit from that. So it's not going to allow that to take place. Turnovers, the quicker, the more turnovers in a period of time that a species can have, think like bacterias or insects maybe, they turn over very quickly. So a generation to generation goes very fast. Where other species that are large, think elephants, even humans, it takes a long time for a generation to turn over. So natural selection may not happen depending on the change and how quickly it takes place in its environment. And then the number of offspring. If you only produce one offspring every couple of years, it's going to be really difficult to have that natural selection take place. It has to be a very slow change in the environment to allow the number of offspring to take that. All right, changes in evolution based on movement of continents around. So we are all familiar with, of course, the continents have shifted over the Earth's history, and species evolve and where they're at. Sometimes they can move from place to place, sometimes they can't. The best interesting example of this is in Australia with the marsupials. They're not exclusive marsupials to Australia, but they're kind of known for being there. It's interesting, so they must have some common ancestor, and a lot of the species there, or the mammals there, tend to have the pouches that most species in other places don't have. So it's kind of an interesting trait that species have there. So they kind of evolve where they are, but if they are allowed to move around, then possibly they can mix.